noticing changes in the environment, either external changes like the temperature or what you see and hear and smell, or internal things, pressure inside your body or stretching or chemical changes and things like that. And these sensations can be either conscious or subconscious sensations. So I've put in, and by the way, I don't think I've posted this yet, but I will post these. I'm making some changes, and I may repost them, as I make more changes, but I will put these notes up as soon as I can. But, if you're talking about sensation, here you have some kind of stimulus like a cactus thorn, and if you poke that cactus thorn, you're going to have a sensation by stimulating sensory receptors. That would be something you would consciously be aware of because there are going to be signals sent to your brain, so you would consciously feel that pain. But many sensations are subconscious, meaning you're detecting sensations, but not consciously aware of them. So blood pressure. You can't tell your blood pressure is changing. And again, that's why they call it the silent killer, because you can't tell when you have high blood pressure. That's why you have to go and check your blood pressure now and then to make sure it's not too high. Because people walk around with high blood pressure can end up with a heart attack or stroke or other things. So you aren't aware of blood pressure. You're not aware of your CO2 levels in your blood and things like that. So some sensations you are not aware of. Those that you are consciously aware of, however, is what we call perception. You're perceiving. You're consciously aware of that sensation, so you're perceiving that sensation. This is happening in the cerebral cortex of the brain. The cerebrum, the major part of your brain. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter at the surface of your brain. And we're going to be talking a bit about that when we get to talking about how the brain interprets sensation. But perception is happening in the cerebral cortex. So some sensation information goes to other parts of the brain, and other parts of the brain are going to process this information at a subconscious level, so you're not perceiving those sensations. But the cerebral cortex allows you to feel sensations. Okay? Any questions about that? All right, now sensory modality. That term means the type of sensation. So you have touch, pressure, pain, vision, hearing, smell. Those are all sensory modalities. That's just the terminology for that. And each sensory receptor is specific for the sensory modality that it senses. So touch receptors are sensitive to touch, but not to other sensations like temperature. Smell receptors detect smell, but they're not going to detect, light or touch or things like that. So you have specific sensory receptors for each modality. Now, you do have pain receptors, and they are specific for pain sensations, pricking or chemicals that cause pain and things like that. But in some cases, you can overstimulate other sensory receptors, and that can create pain. So for example, when you go out, like say you're in a movie theater and it's in the dark, and you go outside and it's suddenly very bright outside, and it's like almost painful to your eyes, the light coming into your eyes, and you have to squint your eyes because it's so bright and sometimes painful. You are overstimulating those sensory receptors in your retina, and that can elicit some pain in that instance. But otherwise, most sensory receptors are very specific, for what they sense. And we're going to talk about different kinds of sensory receptors as we go through here. There's different ways of classifying sensory receptors. So in this case, you have sensory receptors in your fingers and in your skin that detect pain sensations. That would be, pain is a sensory modality, and those pain receptors detect that. Now, we're talking about where perception happens. This is a picture of the cerebrum, and more specifically the cerebral cortex, which is the outer gray matter of the brain. And different parts of the brain, as we'll talk about a little bit later, perceive different sensations. So this area here in blue, the primary somatosensory area, it perceives sensations like touch, pressure, pain, temperature, body position. it's primarily receiving sensations coming from your skin and from muscle and bone, so that you're perceiving all this information coming through your skin, but also information about body position. So if my hand is out here, I know what position it's in. I can feel my fingers moving, and I can feel the position my arm's in, because there's receptors in the muscles and bones and or in the muscles and joints that detect body position. That kind of stuff goes to this part of the brain. So that's where that perception happens. This is the front or anterior side of the brain. This is the posterior side. This is the occipital lobe back here. The green area is where you have the primary visual area, the occipital lobe. Visual information goes all the way back from your eyes to that area, allowing you to perceive, vision, what you see. And then you can see other areas like the primary auditory area that perceives sound. I'm trying to see other areas. Not all the areas are shown. I think there's the primary gustatory area is here. There's also association areas. They're involved in storing and retrieving memories, so that when you have a sensation, you can store it as a memory, but you can also, you recognize it because of previous memories. You're recognizing what you smell or what you're feeling. If you're holding an orange in your hand without looking at it, you can maybe figure out it's an orange because of previous experiences with oranges. So you recognize what you see or feel or touch or whatever. You're recognizing those sensations because association areas in the nearby area of the brain are involved in memory and retrieval of memory, forming and retrieving memory. Okay, so general senses, different kinds. First look at classification of sensory modalities there at the top. In other words, there's different kinds of sensory stimuli or sensory modalities. General senses refers to the general senses like touch, pressure, pain, and things like that. You have different kinds of general senses, somatic as well as visceral or autonomic senses. Somatic meaning what you're consciously aware of. So that previous thing that I showed you here, these sensory areas here are what we would consider to be somatic senses. And those include tactile reception, which is touch reception, and as well as tactile can also refer to pressure. Thermal, which refers to temperature, heat and cold. You have heat receptors, you have cold receptors, two different kinds of thermal receptors. Pain, itch, tickling, vibration, proprioception. These are all primarily in the skin, but proprioception, actually the detection of body position is proprioception. That is receptors in joints and muscles that detect body position and changes in body position, like movement and stuff like that. And then there's visceral or autonomic general senses. These are internal, subconscious types of sensations that you're not perceiving consciously. So that would be things like stretching of organs, like stretching of your stomach, stretching of the heart, stretching of the bladder. You have different organs that have stretch receptors. The uterus has stretch receptors and things like that. Also blood pressure. You have receptors in arteries in your neck that detect blood pressure changes. Temperature, temperature, internal temperature. You have sensors in your brain that detect changes in blood temperature. So not only do you have thermal reception in your skin, you do have thermal reception being detected in your brain when you're monitoring your blood temperature. So that's another one you could add to that. But also chemical changes, particularly in your blood. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH levels are being monitored as well. All of those things, again, are internal. Now, some visceral sensations you are consciously aware of. Most of them you're not, but you are consciously aware of stretching of your bladder and stretching of your stomach. You're aware of things like nausea, an upset stomach, things like that. That would be visceral, but it's something you're conscious. So some of that information is sent to your cerebral cortex. I'm trying to think what else besides stretching. there's something else I was trying to think of, but now I can't think of it. But anyway, there are some things that you are consciously aware of, but most of these you're not conscious of. And then the second major category of sensory modalities would be special senses. We're going to cover the general senses first in this section of the notes. We'll have a separate set of notes for the specific special senses. These are senses that are detected by organs in your head specifically. Vision, hearing, smell, taste, equilibrium, which is detected by equilibrium receptors in your inner ear. All of those are considered to be the special senses. They're covered in a different chapter, so we will come back to those more later. Now, sensory receptors can be classified based on different things, different ways of classifying. One is based on the location of the receptors. You can talk about exteroceptors, which are external, not that they're outside the body, but they are at the surface of the body, and they are detecting things happening at the surface, such as, touch, pressure, pain in the skin, temperature, and then the special senses like, vision, hearing, smell, taste, and sound are somewhat external, coming from the outside, so that would be considered exteroceptors. And so most of this is happening either, in the skin or in the special senses in the head. Then there's interoceptors, also known as visceroceptors, because they're found in the internal organs and also in blood vessel walls, even though blood vessels are not really viscera. When we talk about viscera, we're talking about organs in your thoracic and abdominopelvic cavity. The term visceroceptor also applies to blood vessel receptors like blood pressure and chemical receptors. But interoceptors, means internal stuff. Again, this would be mostly subconscious. I know what other thing I was thinking of, pain. You do feel internal pain, so that would be another sensation you would feel through interoceptors that you would still be conscious of. So there is a little bit of conscious awareness of some of that. Proprioceptors. These are receptors specifically in muscles, tendons, and joints, kind of somewhere between external and internal. They are detecting body position and movement or changes in body position, so that even if you're blind, you know the body position you're in, or if your eyes are closed or you're standing in the dark, you know your body position without looking, right? So that is another type of location-based sensory receptor. Any questions about any of these? Now that's one way of classifying. There's also, you can classify sensory receptors based on type of stimulus. And so this is a bit more specific. Chemoreceptors, which detect chemical changes going on inside organs. And you especially see these a lot when we talk about the blood, and it's the chemicals in the blood. Some of those chemicals are detected. Did you have a question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So with proprioceptors, like they kind of sense how your body's, where they're at. Would like BPV or anything like that interact them or anything?
Say that again.
Like BPV, like
Oh, you think about inner ear stuff?
Yes.
Okay, that's it. Well, your body monitors body position in a couple of ways. One is by vision, so just visual information. If you're tilting over, you're tilting over and you straighten up. So that's one way of monitoring body position. But also by proprioception, and that is, specifically, like I said, in joints and in, I think it says there, no it doesn't, but in joints and muscles primarily. And those detect body, just general position that you're in, throughout your body. And then there's the inner ear, and that would be equilibrium receptors, your semicircular canals that are fluid-filled canals inside your inner ear. So we'll see later that there's this organ in your inner ear. Part of that organ is associated with sound perception, and then there's a part of it that's associated with equilibrium, and it's got these fluid that moves as your head moves. So things like people feeling dizzy or having loss of equilibrium. I'm trying to think of the word now. I can't think of it. It'll come to me later. But anyway, that oftentimes involves the inner ear, those equilibrium receptors in the inner ear. So if people get car sick or seasick and things like that, that's really more inner ear type stuff. So that's a different kind. It's not really considered a proprioceptor, but it does give body position information, at least in the head itself. Yeah. So that would be another type of stimulus. It's not really listed up there, so you could add to that those equilibrium receptors. They don't really fit. Well, they sort of fit in the mechanoreceptor. I think more mechanoreceptor is what they would be considered. Yes.
So, when it comes to like joint pain and stuff like that, would that be proprioceptors or interoceptors?
Well, that's inflammation, and that's probably more pain receptors in the area. You do have internal pain receptors in internal organs and in your muscles and joints. So when there's joint pain, I'd say you're probably getting stimulation of pain receptors in those cases, yeah. But yeah, you have a variety of different kinds of receptors, in these places too, so. Any other questions about that? So photoreceptors, photo in this case means light, like photography and that kind of thing. Photo means light, and so you're able to detect light. Now, of course, we perceive that light as what we see, as vision, and so we have, very specialized structures that allow us to see specific things. There are some organisms that can only perceive light, shadow and light, and that's it. Of course, our eyes are a bit more advanced than that. But photoreceptors are found in the retina of the eye. They do detect light, and then your brain takes that information and creates what you see, what you're actually seeing around you. Thermoreceptors respond to temperature changes. You have heat receptors and cold receptors. They're in your skin, but you also have them in your mouth and throat. So if you're drinking hot coffee and things like that, you're detecting it there as well. Mechanoreceptors respond to deformation of the cell membrane of that sensory neuron. And by that it means that some type of physical mechanical change is pushing on the membrane. Deformation means vibrating or messing with the membrane of the cell. And that opens up mechanically gated channels that allows the inflow of sodium ions. We talked about mechanically gated channels when we looked over, reviewing the nervous system. Mechanoreceptors specifically have that kind of way of being stimulated with mechanically gated channels. So things like touch, pressure, vibration, and sound waves. So not only those structures in your skin that do touch, pressure, vibration types of sensations, but also those in your inner ear that are involved in detecting sound waves. And also I would say equilibrium receptors probably fall in this category too, because they're detecting fluid movement, and that's probably causing deformation of their membranes. So they probably fall into that category. And then nociceptors, nociceptors are pain receptors. Any kind of pain receptor in your body is a nociceptor. And then proprioceptors, as I said, are, specifically muscles and joints and tendons have these structures, and they are detecting body position changes. Okay, any questions about types of stimuli? Okay, now when you are, let me see, it seemed like there was one more category, but maybe, here, let's see what I was going to say about this. I had this thing, okay, I know what it was. All right, I was getting lost in my notes here. Okay, so sensation. Components of a sensation include sensory receptor that is going to be stimulated by a particular stimulus. Sensory receptors are, as I said, specific to the modality that they're stimulated by. Then there's transduction of the stimulus into a depolarizing graded potential there in the neuron. And transduction simply means conversion. In other words, the conversion of the stimulus into a depolarizing graded potential, and we'll review that in just a second, which potentially, that depolarizing graded potential, which is generated in the sensory receptors, can be, if it reaches threshold, it can generate an action potential. So the next part of components of sensation is the generation and propagation of action potentials. Again, these are nerve impulses that are propagated in the axon. And then that information is sent to the central nervous system where there's integration or processing of that sensation. Now, this can happen in the spinal cord, or it can happen in the brain, depending on the situation. So when we say central nervous system there, it's not just the spinal cord, it could be, not just the brain, but it could be the spinal cord is where some perception happens. So again, this picture, which we looked at before, you have, go back to this, stimulation of the neurons. So that's what's happening here when he's pinching a pressure receptor. That's what this is right here, is a pressure receptor, or the receptors are actually in this little capsule right here. That is going to result in the production of a depolarizing graded potential in that pressure receptor. So when we say transduction, it just means that you're going from having the pressure stimulus to a depolarizing graded potential being generated in the dendrite here, in the sensory receptors, which are associated with the dendrites. And then at some point, you're going to hit the axon. Some short distance away, the axon begins. It doesn't really show where it begins, but if you look very closely, you'll see the blue arrows mean graded potentials, in this case depolarizing graded potentials. The black arrow indicates the nerve action potential, and so, about here, I guess, is where the axon would begin. It doesn't show a myelin sheath, so you don't really know exactly, but just assume it's starting here. And then the axon generates and propagates action potentials down the axon into the central nervous system. Now this neuron then stimulates another neuron, an interneuron in the brain, and so there's processing going on here. This interneuron sends signals to another interneuron in this part of the brain. We're going to talk more about this later. And then that neuron sends signals to the appropriate place. These neurons are interpreting that incoming data and deciding where it goes. So, does this information go to the visual area? Does it go to the gustatory area? Does it go to the auditory area? Well, in this case, since it's coming from the skin, these neurons say, okay, that's coming from the skin. It goes to that primary somatosensory area. I don't know if I have that nearby. In other words, how does that information get to the appropriate area? Well, there's interneurons in the brain that receive those signals and say, okay, that's where it goes. Or that's where, depending. If it's visual, it goes here. So you have these interneurons that are detecting incoming data and deciding where it goes in the brain for integration. Yes?
Could you kind of generalize where the sensations in the brain are happening? Would the touch sensation really be in the parietal lobe or anything?
Well, if you look at this picture, let's see. The lobes are, this is the frontal lobe, and mostly motor areas are in the frontal lobe, and some association areas, like the prefrontal cortex. Your conscious thought is primarily happening there, thinking and judgment and things like that. But a lot of these areas here in the frontal lobe are motor areas. There is a groove in the brain between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and that groove is called the central sulcus. And behind the central sulcus, or posterior to that, is a ridge of gray matter called the postcentral gyrus. And that ridge, where the primary somatosensory area is, and we'll talk more about that later, that's the parietal lobe. And there's this nearby association area there. The occipital lobe is here in this green area, and that's where your visual area is. And then you've got the temporal lobe, which would be here beside your head, and that's where you have the auditory area, and I think the equilibrium area is in that area too. So so does that answer your question? So it kind of gives you a general idea. We'll talk more about that later on at some point. We're going to be discussing that because the areas of the brain have been mapped out. During brain surgeries, they can stimulate different parts of the brain and map out what functions those parts of the brain have. Okay, so that's how they figured that out. Now, as I said, you have stimulation of the receptor, which we just saw with the pressure receptor. You got transduction of that stimulus into a depolarizing graded potential by some mechanism. In the case of the mechanically gated channels here, you've got, this is an instance of a mechanoreceptor. It's got mechanically gated channels that open when you put pressure on the membrane of that dendrite. So mechanically gated channels open inflows sodium ions, that depolarizes the dendrite, and that causes depolarizing graded potentials to be generated. If you do this enough to reach threshold of the action potential, then action potentials get generated and propagated. Generated just means formed, and then propagated means it's conducted up the axon. So that would be this right here. And then the central nervous system, like here and in the cerebral cortex, that's where you have integration or processing of that sensation. In this case, it would be going to that primary somatosensory area that we were talking about, and that is where you have perception of the sensation. Now, in some cases, as we'll see, and I thought I had a picture of that here. Unfortunately, I'll have to replace this picture because it's messed up with that clicking. But anyway, in this case, you got sensation here being perceived, or being sensed, I should say. So when you prick your finger, like with a needle, that's going to cause transduction of a depolarizing graded potential in the sensory nerve endings here, in the receptors. And then you're going to, the depolarizing graded potentials are going to generate an action potential. And now you've got stimulation of an interneuron in the spinal cord. That's where the processing is happening. This would be subconscious processing. This is an example of subconscious processing, not in the brain, but in the spinal cord. And what they don't show you in this picture is, and that I'll have to fix, is that what this interneuron does is when it's stimulated, it automatically stimulates a motor neuron to send signals out to the muscle to cause muscle stimulation. Now, that is subconscious. Your interneuron here is just making a decision, automatic decision. It's automatic, doesn't require much processing. But what they don't show you here is that you're going to have an axon collateral, a branch that goes up the ascending tract to the brain, sending signals to your cerebral cortex, to that somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex, telling you that you feel pain. So while this is going on, you're also sending signals up to your brain. You're going to feel that sensation. So not only are you having subconscious processing of the information, controlling that reflex of pulling your hand away, but you're also going to send signals to your brain, so you're going to feel that pain. You might respond to that pain by shaking your hand or cussing or something like that. You may have a conscious response as well as that automatic response. So in some cases, you're going to have more than one processing happening. You may have both or subconscious and conscious processing happening with a sensation. I don't really have a picture to show you, but let me go back for a moment. So if this were some kind of sensation happening internally, some kind of visceral sensation, that would be sent by sensory neurons. Sensory receptors here are going to respond to that stimulus. They're going to transduct that stimulus into a depolarizing graded potential, which then generates action potentials that get sent through nerves to the brain. But that information is going to go to other parts of the brain. It might go to the hypothalamus, or it might go to other brain centers that process that subconscious sensation. So you're not consciously aware of it, but your brain is aware of it at a subconscious level. So there's subconscious processing that goes on as well. Depends on the type of sensation it is. If that makes sense. So integration can be at a conscious or subconscious level, and it can be in the brain or spinal cord, or both in some cases. So you can have both conscious and subconscious going on at the same time. Any questions about that so far? Okay, so just be sure you understand the terminology, like what transduction means. It just means converting a stimulus into a depolarizing graded potential. As I said, the graded potential is depolarizing. It has to reach threshold in order to get an action potential. If it's a weak stimulus, it's not going to get an action potential. And I think I have a picture of that in just a moment. Now, as I said, each sensory receptor is very specific to the modality that it's going to respond to. So a visual receptor is gonna respond to light, it's not gonna respond to touch or sound waves or things like that. And, or, you know, a smell receptor is not gonna respond to light. They're very specific to what they respond to, because they're stimulated in specific ways, so they're only gonna respond to a specific type of sensation. Let me see if there's anything here I didn't say already. I think this pretty much says the same thing I've just been talking about,